The ferry's engine groaned, a deep, persistent rumble that vibrated through the worn deck planks and up into Dean's teeth. He leaned against the rusty railing, the salt-laced wind whipping strands of dark hair across his face. Below, the slate-gray waters of the channel churned, reflecting a sky the color of bruised plums. The mainland had receded hours ago, a blurry memory of traffic and too many sympathetic glances. Here, there was only the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, and ahead, a smudge of land barely visible through the shifting veils of fog. The island. His grandfather's island. A fresh start, he'd told himself. A refuge. The words felt hollow, a whisper against the roaring silence within him. It had been 6 months since the accident. 6 months since the world had cleaved itself in two, leaving him on the wrong side of a chasm he couldn't bridge. The cartography firm, his meticulously drawn maps, the quiet comfort of precision. It all felt like a life lived by a different man. Now there was only this inherited solitude, a distant relative's final, unexpected gesture. As the ferry drew closer, the island began to assert itself. A skeletal forest of wind-blasted pines clung precariously to the higher slopes, their branches gnarled and contorted like arthritic fingers. Below it, clinging to the cliff edge like a barnacle, was the cottage. A squat stone structure, gray and weathered, with a single small chimney exhaling a thin W curl of smoke. A caretaker, he presumed, had aired it out for him. This wasn't just isolation. It was abandonment. The ferry docked at a small, ramshackle pier, its timbers groaning under the weight. A solitary figure, the island's caretaker, stood waiting, a heavy oilskin coat drawn tight against the wind. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of old glass. He merely grunted a greeting, took Dean's duffel bag, and gestured towards a battered utility vehicle. Dean followed, his boots crunching on the gravelly shore. The drive was short, but felt interminable. The narrow, unpaved road snaked inland, through a landscape that seemed to shrink and huddle against the incessant wind. They were stark, functional, and utterly out of place amidst the wild, untamed nature of the island. A faded sign, half obscured by overgrown brambles, read, "Research Station." He wondered what kind of research required such a remote, desolate outpost. The caretaker offered no explanation, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. They arrived at the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, hunkering low to the ground as if trying to hide from the elements. The stone walls were grimy with lichen, the slate roof sagged in places, and the small windows were opaque with sea salt and grime. A rusted iron gate creaked mournfully as the caretaker pushed it open, revealing a path choked with weeds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, old wood, and something vaguely metallic, like forgotten tools. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy panes. Dean ran a hand over the rough surface of the mantelpiece. Everything felt imbued with the weight of time, of lives lived and ended here. The caretaker deposited his bag and mumbled something about checking the generator later. Dean barely registered the words. He was already exploring, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the bare floorboards. In the small kitchen, a rusty sink dripped rhythmically. He found the kettle, filled it, and set it on the gas hob. The hiss of the flame was a small comfort. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the windows in shades of bruised purple and gray, Dean sat in the armchair, listening to the house settle around him. The wind moaned outside, a mournful, drawn-out cry that seemed to carry an edge of human grief. The waves crashed against the cliffs below, a constant rhythmic thrum against the very foundations of the island. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the image of his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, a man who had lived and died in this desolate place. But the image wouldn't form. Instead, a different sound began to filter through the wind's lament. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching. It came from the walls, or perhaps the floorboards, a delicate, insistent scraping like claws on stone. Nothing. The sound ceased, leaving only the wind and the waves. Dean dismissed it. Old house, settling wood, mice perhaps? He stood, moving to the nearest window. He peered out, trying to pierce the gathering gloom. The fog was rolling in, thick and heavy, swallowing the distant horizon, obscuring the sea. Then he saw it. Or thought he did. It was gone before he could focus, a mere impression, like a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the rising mist. His breath caught in his throat. He strained his eyes, but there was nothing. Only the hungry roar of the sea and the deepening, impenetrable gray. He wasn't alone here. The ferry finally nudged against the barnacled timbers of the small dock, its engine sputtering into silence. Dean gripped his duffel bag, the cold metal of the railing biting into his palm. The island loomed, a jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, cloaked in a perpetual damp breath of fog. No welcoming committee, no curious faces. Just the ferryman, a gaunt, silent man with eyes like chipped slate, who merely grunted before securing the lines. Dean stepped onto the narrow pier, the planks groaning beneath his weight. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of brine and something else. Something ancient, like wet stone and decaying kelp. He glanced back at the ferryman, but the man was already turning the vessel, its engine coughing back to life, the sound quickly swallowed by the encroaching mist. Dean was alone. The cottage stood a short, uphill walk from the dock, a squat, gray stone structure huddled against the relentless wind. Its windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare out to sea with an air of profound melancholy. He ran a hand over a dusty wooden table, the grit clinging to his fingers. This was it, his new beginning. Or, at least, a place to hide. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and attempting to bring life back to the desolate space. He cleaned, he aired out, he tried to make it his own. But even amidst his efforts, the island's peculiar nature began to assert itself. He was a cartographer, a man who understood the rhythm of the earth and the predictable dance of the tides. Yet he noticed the water. It didn't behave as it should. One morning, the tide receded further than any chart suggested, exposing a vast, slick expanse of seabed usually submerged. He walked along the unusual shoreline, the wet sand sucking at his boots, revealing bizarre, twisted forms of kelp and barnacled rocks that seemed to writhe in the exposed light. He knelt, examining the tide line. The evidence was clear. The water had pulled back an improbable distance. He checked his tide tables, consulted his grandfather's old, faded charts. They were all consistent. The sea, however, was not. He frowned, attributing it to an unusually strong current, perhaps, or a localized weather phenomenon. The island was remote. Anomalies were to be expected. The next day, the opposite occurred. The high tide swelled to an alarming degree, waves crashing against the rocks closer to the cottage than he'd ever witnessed. The rumble of the surf was a constant, unsettling drumbeat. They began subtly, carried on the relentless wind that ceaselessly scoured the island. At first, he dismissed them as the mournful cry of gulls or the sigh of the wind through the eaves. But as the days bled into weeks, the sounds grew more distinct, more insistent. They were not words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur, a chorus of sibilant tones that seemed to rise from the very stones of the island, from the depths of the fog itself. He'd be sketching a contour line on a new map, or boiling water for coffee, and the sound would seep into the quiet, a faint, unsettling hum that prickled the hairs on his arms. He'd pause, straining his ears, but then it would fade, leaving only the howl of the wind and the crash of the waves. He was still grieving after all. His senses were likely heightened, distorted. It was during one of these bouts of rationalization that he found it. Tucked away in a decaying sea chest, beneath a stack of mildewed navigation logs, he discovered a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was warped, its pages stained a sickly yellow-brown, as if it had been submerged and dried out multiple times. The leather felt strangely slick beneath his fingers, almost like cured hide. He opened it carefully. The script was his grandfather's, a familiar spidery scrawl, but the contents were anything but. The initial entries were mundane, observations about weather and supplies. But quickly, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew erratic, the sentences fragmented, interspersed with disturbing sketches. And then, the words. The tides are wrong, they speak of the deep song. Dean's breath hitched. He traced a finger over a particularly grotesque sketch, a swirling vortex of water with an indistinct, monstrous shape at its core. Below it, in bold, almost desperate strokes, was written, "It stirs. The pact is broken. The deep song pulls." His grandfather, a man of quiet stoicism, had never spoken of such things. Dean had always known him as a practical, grounded individual. What was this? The ramblings of an old man succumbing to loneliness and the harsh realities of island life? A descent into madness, perhaps, brought on by years of isolation. He tried to force the rational explanation into place, but the journal felt too real, too visceral. The pages smelled of the sea, of something ancient and decaying, a smell that now seemed to cling to his own skin. He flipped through more pages, his eyes scanning the frantic entries. There were mentions of strange lights in the water, of things pulled from the nets that defied classification, and increasingly, of a specific location, a derelict research station on the island's northernmost point. His grandfather had apparently made frequent clandestine visits there, his entries growing more desperate with each trip. They studied it, one entry read. They woke it, and now it sings. Dean closed the journal with a snap, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. His hands were trembling. He looked around the study, at the familiar mundane objects. The barometer, the charts, the worn compass. They seemed to mock him, their quiet stability a stark contrast to the chaos contained within the leather-bound book. He wanted to dismiss it all, to chalk it up to a vivid imagination, to the grief that still gnawed at him. The rational explanations felt thin, fragile, like a crumbling seawall against an encroaching, relentless tide. He was determined to find an answer, even if it meant confronting his grandfather's madness. Or something worse. The tremble in Dean's hands had not entirely subsided, but a new, cold resolve had replaced the initial shock. The journal, heavy and unsettling, now felt less like a relic of a disturbed mind, and more like a crucial, if terrifying, map. He couldn't dismiss his grandfather's cryptic entries as mere ramblings any longer. Not after the strange sensations, not after the pervasive chill that seemed to seep into the very foundations of the cottage. He needed answers, and the only place on the island likely to hold anything resembling historical records was the old research station. The journey was a slow crawl through the persistent mist. Dean navigated the winding, overgrown track in the utility vehicle he'd brought over, the tires crunching on loose gravel. The air was thick with the scent of salt and damp earth, a smell that had once been comforting but now carried a faint, cloying undertone, like something decaying just out of sight. He felt a profound isolation, not just from the world, but from any sense of familiar reality. The research station stood on a less exposed northern promontory, a squat stone building that looked as though it had been absorbed by the landscape over decades. Its windows were grimy, its wooden door warped, yet it was still functional, maintained by a reclusive caretaker who visited only twice a year. Inside, the air was cool and stagnant, smelling of dust, old paper, and something vaguely metallic. Fluorescent lights flickered to life with a groan, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over rows of metal shelving stacked with binders, maps, and ancient leather-bound volumes. Dean, a cartographer by trade, felt a perverse comfort in the systematic arrangement, even amidst the pervasive sense of neglect. He began sifting through maritime charts, geological surveys, and local histories. Hours blurred into a single, focused pursuit. He uncovered references to the island's original name, Cathar, a guttural sound that seemed to catch in his throat. Buried within a collection of transcribed oral traditions, he found them. The legends, tales of a sunken city, not far from the island's western shore, swallowed by the sea in an ancient cataclysm. The texts spoke of colossal cyclopean architecture, visible only during the lowest tides of the winter solstice, shimmering with an unearthly luminescence. They spoke of the island's early inhabitants, a secluded community that worshipped the deep, performing strange rites to appease something vast and ancient that slumbered beneath the waves. There were mentions of offerings, of sacrifices, and of a binding agreement, a pact, made to ensure the island's safety from the sea's wrath, a pact that demanded a cyclical renewal. His grandfather's journal entries, once disjointed and paranoid, were beginning to coalesce into a horrific narrative. He returned to the cottage as dusk bled into a starless night, the fog clinging to the windows like pallid specters. The journal lay open on his study desk, its pages now far less cryptic. The deep calls, the pact must be honored, the blood sacrifice. These phrases, once nonsensical, now echoed with a terrible clarity. His grandfather hadn't been mad. He had been documenting a malevolent truth that defied reason, a truth buried in the island's very foundations. That night, the dreams came. They were not vague or fleeting, but vivid, visceral assaults on his subconscious. Shapes, immense and indistinct, drifted in the periphery of his vision. Colossal forms that moved with an unnatural grace, their presence radiating a primal hunger. He felt himself being pulled, not by a current, but by an unseen force, a suction that threatened to tear him apart. He woke with a gasp, the taste of brine still sharp in his mouth, his sheets tangled around him like a shroud. His skin felt clammy, his muscles aching as if he'd been struggling against an impossible current. The cottage was silent, save for the creak of the old timbers and the distant moan of the foghorn. He pushed himself upright, his heart thrumming against his ribs. On the wooden floor beside his bed, a patch of something alien pulsed with a soft green-blue light. It was algae, unmistakably, but unlike any he had ever seen. Its tendrils, delicate and gelatinous, spread across the grain of the floorboards, shimmering faintly, as if capturing moonlight from an unseen source. He knelt, a knot of revulsion and fascination tightening in his gut. The texture was slick, cool, and surprisingly firm beneath his fingertips. He followed the faint glow. Another patch clung to the rough stone of the fireplace hearth. A third, smaller bloom had somehow taken root in the damp grout between the kitchen tiles. It was spreading, subtly, insidiously, a silent, creeping infestation. This wasn't just a dream or a legend. The deep was sending its emissaries, breaching the threshold of his reality. The ink, faded to sepia, still held the weight of his grandfather's frantic hand. This wasn't the rambling of a man lost to the isolation. It was a desperate plea, a terrifying map to a hidden reality. He pushed back from the table, the old chair scraping a protest across the floorboards. The cottage felt different now, no longer merely old and damp, but charged, watchful. He listened, not just to the wind rattling the window panes, but to something beneath, something that seemed to hum in the very foundation of the island. It was subtle at first, a low thrum that vibrated more in his bones than in his ears, like the distant churn of a colossal, submerged engine. But the hum persisted, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to ebb and flow with the tide, growing stronger as the afternoon light began to fade. He walked to the window, staring out at the gray expanse of the ocean, trying to pinpoint its source. A thin sheen of moisture coated the glass, blurring the distant line where sky met water. As he leaned closer, his breath fogging the pane, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. For a fleeting instant, the face staring back was not his. The eyes were too wide, too dark, and the skin seemed to ripple as if seen through disturbed water. He blinked, and his own weary features returned. The illusion vanished. Dean spun away from the window, his gaze sweeping the familiar, cluttered room. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound without origin, yet undeniably present. He watched a small, tarnished silver locket, a forgotten trinket on the mantelpiece, begin to sway almost imperceptibly, a slow pendulum motion that grew steadily wider until it tapped against the stone. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. His breath hitched. He moved through the cottage, guided by a gnawing curiosity and the journal's unsettling implications. The pages spoke of warding circles and the hungry deep. He found them in the small, rarely used pantry, hidden behind stacks of dusty, labeled tins. Scratched into the wooden floorboards, barely visible beneath a film of grime, was a series of crude, angular symbols, forming a rough circle. He remembered a detail from the journal, a reference to a place of quiet contemplation on the island's eastern side. He recognized the description. A small, dilapidated structure, barely more than a shed, that his grandfather had always called his research station. He'd never seen the point of it, just a weathered shack with a single boarded-up window, standing precariously close to the cliff edge. Now, a terrible understanding began to dawn. He grabbed a lantern, its glass chiming faintly as he descended the worn steps from the cottage. The fog had thickened, pressing in from the sea, muffling the usual sounds of gulls and distant waves. The hum, however, seemed to cut through it, a low, persistent thrumming that grew more distinct with every step he took towards the research station. The path was slick with damp earth and decaying leaves. He found the structure half collapsed, its roof sagged, timbers groaning under the constant assault of the elements. Pushing open the warped, protesting door, Dean shone his lantern inside. The air was thick with the smell of salt, damp earth, and something else. A faint metallic tang that prickled his nose. The research station was small, a single room, dominated by a large, rough-hewn stone altar in the center. A collection of small, jagged shells, unlike any he'd ever seen on the island's beaches, were arranged in precise patterns around the base. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on something small and brittle. He lowered the lantern. Scattered across the floor were tiny fragments of bone, some smooth and polished, others sharp and splintered. They were too small to be from any large animal, perhaps birds, or even smaller creatures. The implications settled over him like a shroud. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to ward something off. He'd been feeding it, or perhaps attempting to appease it. The hum in the air pulsed, growing louder, more insistent, vibrating through the very soles of his feet. Dean froze, his hand tightening around the lantern's cold metal. He heard it again, closer this time, a heavy, dragging sound, wet and sickeningly organic. The doorway, previously a rectangle of impenetrable gray fog, now seemed to ripple, distorting the light. A primal scream caught in Dean's throat. He stumbled backward, tripping over a loose stone, landing hard on the damp earth. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, reverberating through his skull, threatening to tear his mind apart. He scrambled backwards, pushing himself up, his eyes fixed on the encroaching horror. It was closer now, its vastness pressing against the confines of the research station, making the air grow impossibly heavy. This wasn't a trick of the light, not a hallucination. This was real. This was what his grandfather had faced. And it was here. With a desperate, animalistic surge of adrenaline, Dean lunged for the fallen lantern, snatching it up. He didn't know what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't let it touch him. He swung the heavy lantern, not at the form itself, but at the remaining doorframe, hoping to dislodge something, anything. The metal crashed against the rotten wood, sending splinters flying. The impact, small as it was, seemed to momentarily disrupt the surging form. It recoiled slightly, a subtle ripple through its watery mass, as if momentarily hesitant. That was all the opening Dean needed. He burst past the edge of the form, squeezing through the narrow gap, not daring to look back, plunging headlong into the suffocating fog outside. His lungs burned, his legs pumped, carrying him away from the research station, away from the impossible, terrible presence that now held dominion over the island. He had to understand. A cold resolve had settled within Dean, stark and sharp as the island's wind. The journal, his grandfather's frantic testament, pulsed with an unnerving energy beneath his fingertips. He leaned closer, the scent of aged paper and something metallic. Old iron, perhaps, from the lighthouse itself, filling his nostrils. The passage about the pull from below and offerings to keep the silence snagged at his thoughts, a burr under the skin of his mind. He wasn't just reading history, he was deciphering a desperate warning. He spent the next hours hunched over the scarred pine, tracing the faded script with a finger that felt suddenly clumsy. His grandfather's hand had grown increasingly erratic on the later pages, the looping letters sometimes blurring into indecipherable scrawls. Dean found himself squinting, trying to separate the deliberate words from what might have been a tremor. He pieced together fragments, dates mostly. His grandfather hadn't just been a witness to the island's strange phenomena. He had been an active participant. The journal detailed a ritualistic cycle, a schedule of maintenance to keep the sleeping Leviathan from fully awakening. His grandfather, the quiet, stoic man he barely remembered, had been performing these grim rites. Not a madman, Dean realized with a sickening lurch, but a guardian, burdened by a terrible pact. The weight of that understanding pressed down on him, heavy as the island's fog. He flipped to a later section, the pages growing even more brittle. Here, the entries became less about the rituals and more about the psychological toll. "The song begins again," one entry read, the words smudged as if written in haste or distress. "It seeps into the stone, into the very air. I hear it in the wind, in the crash of the waves. It tells me things, terrible things. It was barely perceptible, a resonance rather than an audible tone, yet it set his teeth on edge." He paused, listening. The hum intensified, a deep thrumming that felt like it was coming from inside his own skull. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. It was an impossible sound, a bass note that resonated with something primal, something old. He opened his eyes, heart hammering. The hum receded, leaving only the familiar roar of the waves and the creak of the old timbers. Had he imagined it? He found a crudely drawn map tucked between two pages, a sketch of the island with an X marked near the lighthouse's base, annotated with the words, "The Gate. Guard it." Another, more intriguing note, scrawled in a frantic hand, simply stated, "Check the research station. They know more than they let on. The old records, the deep currents." The research station. Dean remembered hearing vague rumors of a small, defunct meteorological post on the island's less accessible eastern side, long abandoned. His grandfather had visited it? Why? What old records? The implication was clear. There were others who knew, or at least had known, about the entity. His grandfather hadn't been entirely alone in his grim vigil. The hum returned then, stronger this time, a pervasive thrum that seemed to vibrate his bones. It wasn't just a sound. It was a sensation, a pressure in his skull, an insistent deep pulse that mirrored the rhythm of the waves crashing against the cliffs. He fought it, shaking his head violently. This was the song. It was starting. He gripped the journal, knuckles white. Each step echoed the thrumming in his head. At the bottom, where the spiral staircase ended, a thick wooden door, reinforced with rusted iron bands, stood flush against the stone wall. He'd noticed it before, dismissed it as a storage closet. But the X on the map, the insistence in the journal, screamed otherwise. This wasn't just storage. This was the gate. He tugged at the iron ring handle. It was stiff, rusted into place. He put his shoulder to the door, pushing with all his might. The wood groaned, a sound like an old beast waking. With a final, desperate heave, the door lurched inward, scraping against the stone floor, revealing a gaping maw of absolute blackness. It was the smell of something very old, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very stone of the lighthouse, pulling at him. The pull from below was no longer just a phrase in a journal. The last groan of the ancient door echoed, swallowed by the cavernous space beyond. Dean stumbled forward, his breath catching in his throat, his hands still stinging from the effort. The air that rushed out to meet him was thick and cold, carrying the acrid tang of ozone mixed with something else. Something profoundly old and mineral, like wet rock and forgotten metals. It was a smell that burrowed into the back of his sinuses, a flavor on the tongue. His lamp, clutched tight, cut a trembling swathe through the gloom. He was not in a natural cave. This was a chamber hewn from the bedrock, its walls rough-cut stone, streaked with what looked like dried brine and something darker, almost like rust. The floor was uneven, littered with detritus. Shattered glass, corroded metal frames, and what might have been broken ceramic jars. This was it then. Not a hidden grotto, but a constructed space, long abandoned. As his lamp beam swept across the expanse, he saw tables, or what remained of them, collapsing under the weight of time and damp. Wires snaked across the floor, thick and insulated, leading to rusted control panels with dials frozen in place, their glass faces milky with age. This was a forgotten outpost, a desolate testament to some past endeavor. At the center of the largest chamber, where the hum was strongest, stood a structure that defied description. It was not built, but grown. Dean took a hesitant step closer, then another. The violet light deepened, then faded, then flared again, mirroring a slow, deliberate beat. He could feel it in his own chest, a sympathetic rhythm trying to assert itself over his own frantic heartbeat. He lifted his lamp higher, trying to discern details in the strange light. The surface of the obsidian was not smooth. It rippled, subtly, like liquid mercury trapped beneath a hard shell. And within its depths, as the light pulsed, he saw movement. Not just reflections, but something inside. A low guttural sound, not from his own throat, but seemingly from the very air around him, filled the chamber. It was a sound that scraped against the inside of his skull, a language not meant for human ears. The violet light intensified, burning brighter, and the hum became a roar, vibrating through his bones. Dean clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was internal, inescapable. Then the world warped. The walls of the research station seemed to dissolve, replaced by an infinite crushing black. Images flooded his mind, unbidden, overwhelming. He saw the island, his lighthouse, reduced to mere specks, then swallowed by an encroaching tide of black, viscous water. He saw the ocean floor, not as he knew it, but as a vast, lightless landscape of impossible geological formations, titanic structures that were both organic and mineral, stretching into an unseen horizon. Not a single form, but a colossal ancient presence, a consciousness so vast and alien it made his mind reel. It was a hunger, an ancient, patient malevolence stirring from eons of slumber. He saw with horrifying clarity the pact, Not a written contract, but an understanding, an exchange, made by those who came before, those who had built this very research station. They had sought something, perhaps knowledge, perhaps power, and in doing so, they had offered a conduit, a pathway. The vision intensified. He was a mote, a flicker, and it was coming to extinguish him. His mind screamed, a silent shriek that echoed in the vast emptiness of the vision. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision shattered. The crushing black receded, replaced by the familiar, yet now infinitely more menacing, stone walls of the research station. The hum of the obsidian mass subsided to its former thrum, the violet light to its rhythmic pulse. He scrambled away from the pulsating heart of the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands shaking violently. It was here. It was awake, and it was coming for him. The revelation was not just of its existence, but of its immediate, undeniable proximity, and the horrifying truth of its ancient, all-consuming hunger. His boots scraped on a gritty floor, not the smooth rock of the tunnel, but a rough, uneven surface. He blinked, trying to pierce the gloom, but the darkness here was absolute, heavier than any he'd known. It pressed in, a physical weight against his eyes. It revealed a vast subterranean chamber, carved roughly from the island's bedrock. Water dripped from unseen fissures high above, echoing like slow, deliberate footsteps. The walls were slick with condensation, gleaming with a faint, iridescent sheen where the light touched them. He saw hulking, rusted machinery, half submerged in shallow pools that mirrored the ceiling's spectral shimmer. Cables, thick as his arm, snaked across the floor, disappearing into the murk. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a place of human endeavor, long abandoned, now reclaimed by the earth and something far older. This was the research station his grandfather had mentioned in his frantic notes, hidden beneath the lighthouse itself. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a resonant frequency, a sound that seemed to originate from within his own skull. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the vibration persisted, an internal thrumming that threatened to unravel his thoughts. Not a visual distortion, but a profound, sickening impression, as if the very fabric of the air was churning, coalescing. "You are mine." Dean stumbled back, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He turned, desperate to retreat, to slam the ancient door shut and seal away this encroaching horror. But the passage he'd come through was gone. The rock face was unbroken, seamless, as if the door had never existed, as if the tunnel had simply folded in on itself. He was trapped. It wasn't just in the air now. It was in him. It sought purchase, a way to anchor itself, to take root. He gritted his teeth, clenching his fists, fighting the sickening sensation of intrusion. This wasn't just encroaching. It was actively trying to break through, to possess him, to wear his flesh like a borrowed coat. His gaze fell upon the leather-bound journal clutched in his trembling hand. His grandfather's frantic, half-mad scrawlings were his only hope. He flipped through pages filled with sketches of impossible geometry and indecipherable symbols, past paragraphs detailing the entity's slow awakening, its ancient hunger. He ignored the increasingly erratic handwriting, the smudges of ink, and what he prayed were only water stains. He found it, near the end, a series of pages torn and then hastily taped back together. The ink almost faded into illegibility. His grandfather's writing here was less a script and more a desperate scramble of lines. It spoke of a binding, a reversal, a final offering. Dean leaned closer, straining his eyes. The text detailed a complex ritual, a countermeasure to the pact that had first awakened the entity. It involved the convergence of three specific elements, three anchors that held the entity's presence to this plane. One was the lighthouse's beam, acting as a beacon, a lure. Another, the deep-sea currents that brought the entity's influence to the island. The third was obscured, almost scratched out, but Dean could make out fragments. A vessel, a living conduit. It depicted a figure standing at the center of a swirling vortex, hands outstretched, being consumed by the very energy it sought to control. A terrible sacrifice. Not of an object, not of an animal. A living conduit. A vessel. Someone had to willingly offer themselves, not just their life, but their very essence, to become the final anchor, to contain the entity, to become the living prison for an ancient horror. It was about containing it, holding it captive in a perpetual agonizing embrace. And the seal would only last for as long as the sacrifice endured. Dean felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He looked around the vast, echoing chamber, at the rusted machinery that hinted at forgotten attempts to harness or understand the entity. His grandfather had come here, had tried to decipher this, had known this terrible truth. Had he intended to make that sacrifice himself? Or had he been searching for someone else? The pressure in Dean's mind intensified, a sharp, piercing pain. Yield, release, become one. He squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the journal, the rough leather digging into his palm. A terrible choice lay before him, a burden of impossible weight. The entity was breaking through. But at what cost? Who would be the vessel? Who would endure the unending horror of being the seal? The entity was no longer content to merely whisper. It roared now, a silent, guttural sound that vibrated not in the air, but directly behind Dean's eyes. He sat hunched in the cottage's main room, the journal splayed open on the scarred table, its pages brittle beneath his trembling fingers. Outside, the storm was a living thing. Not the usual gale that shrieked and battered, but a tempest of impossible angles and colors. The rain fell in sheets so thick they seemed to solidify the air, yet the wind howled with a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper against bone. Through the streaked window panes, Dean glimpsed the sea, not crashing in rhythmic waves, but heaving and convulsing, its surface scarred by strange phosphorescent currents that pulsed like diseased veins. His head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against his skull. The entity's pressure was a physical weight, pressing down on his thoughts, trying to flatten them, to make space for its own alien designs. It was a hunger, ancient and profound, and it wanted him. He reread the final faded script in the journal, his grandfather's elegant hand now seeming both impossibly distant and terrifyingly immediate. The counter-ritual. The last resort. It demanded an anchor, a sacrifice of connection, a severing of the link the pact had forged. But the cost, the true cost, had only been hinted at in the earlier entries, veiled in cryptic warnings. Now the final pages laid it bare. It wasn't just a physical act, a specific location or item. The ritual required a part of him. Not his life, not his body, but his memory. The entity fed on connection, on the very threads that wove a person to their past, to their loved ones, to their identity. To sever its hold, Dean would have to offer up his most cherished recollections, the very essence of what made him Dean. The memory of her, his lost love, the reason he'd sought this solitude, would be the price. A terrible bargain. A piece of him would be gone forever, not forgotten, but unremembered, erased from his internal landscape. A shudder ran through the cottage. Not the wind, but the very ground. Outside, a guttural shriek tore through the unnatural storm, not from any animal Dean recognized, but from something vast and unseen, echoing from the depths. He stumbled to the window, peering through the gloom. The cliff face, usually a stark gray, now glistened with an unholy sheen. Patches of rock seemed to weep a viscous black ichor, and barnacles, once dormant, had grown to grotesque sizes, pulsing faintly with a sickly green light. Tendrils of kelp, thicker than his arm, thrashed against the rocks, not with the rhythm of the waves, but with an independent, desperate life. The island was transforming, becoming a festering wound. His heart did not pound. It felt frozen, a block of ice in his chest. This was it. The entity was breaking through. His hands, though still shaking, moved with a newfound purpose. He gathered the few items listed in the journal. A small, intricately carved bone charm his grandfather had kept, a handful of dried sea salt, and a shard of obsidian found years ago on a distant beach, its surface slick and black. He wrapped them carefully in a scrap of oilskin. The journey to the research station would be perilous. It sat on the island's highest point, a desolate concrete structure built by a long-abandoned geological survey team. His grandfather had mentioned it sparingly, a place of isolated study, a perfect forgotten crucible. Dean knew the path well, but not under these conditions. The entity's influence made the very ground beneath his boots feel unstable, treacherous. He hefted the small satchel containing the ritual components, the weight of it pressing against his side. The choice was made. The cost understood. He would walk into that storm, into the heart of the island's corruption, and perform a ritual that would strip him of his past, of the very grief he had sought to escape. But it would save the island. It would stop the entity. Stepping out into the maelstrom, the wind ripped at him, a physical blow. The unnatural rain stung his skin. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and rank, like primordial mud. The station itself seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency, a beacon of forgotten knowledge and imminent confrontation. The silent roar behind Dean's eyes had grown into a sustained, grinding tremor. It was the sound of bedrock tearing, of an unimaginable weight shifting in the abyssal dark. The journal lay open, its pages brittle, an antique map to damnation. His trembling fingers traced the crude, frantic sketches his grandfather had scrawled. Warding symbols, swirling currents, and an ominous central sigil that pulsed with a malevolent energy even on the page. The ritual, the sealing. It was the only way, the desperate final gamble his grandfather had outlined in his descent into madness. Dean pushed away from the table, the old wood groaning in protest. But the image of his lost wife, her face clear and strong in his mind, stiffened his resolve. He wouldn't let this thing take anyone else. He grabbed the oil lamp, its flickering flame a meager defiance against the encroaching gloom. Outside, the fog had thickened into an impenetrable shroud, muffling the world, making the familiar path to the lighthouse a treacherous, unseen gauntlet. The path, usually a clear track of worn earth and stone, was now an indistinct blur. He stumbled, his boots sinking into the wet, yielding ground. It was no longer behind his eyes. It was inside his head, a relentless, crushing weight. The journal had mentioned a final component, a specific weathered stone his grandfather had found, imbued with the island's original, untainted energy. It was not in the cottage. The last entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, pointed to the research station. A derelict, forgotten building, further along the cliff edge, where his grandfather had once conducted his more esoteric studies. The research station was a longer walk, a detour through the deepening chaos. But he had no choice. Each step was a battle against the entity's will, which sought to paralyze him, to drown him in despair. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, then forced them open, pushing forward. The research station emerged from the fog like a skeletal hand. Its windows shattered, its corrugated iron roof rusted and buckling. A stench, ancient and putrid, wafted out, a mix of damp earth, decaying fish, and something else. Something utterly alien and profoundly wrong. Dean's stomach churned, but he pressed on, stepping over the threshold. Inside, the air was still, heavy with dust and the lingering echo of despair. Shelves lined with shattered glass beakers and overturned instruments stood like silent sentinels. He moved methodically, the journal clutched in one hand, the lamp in the other, searching for the stone of balance his grandfather had described. The entity's presence here was suffocating, a silent scream that grated against his sanity. Then he saw it. It felt ancient, heavy, and strangely comforting in his palm, a tiny bastion against the encroaching horror. With the stone secured, he turned towards the lighthouse, its beam a distant, struggling pulse against the swirling gray. The journey felt endless. The path became steeper, the wind a physical assault, threatening to tear him from the cliff face. He bit back a cry, his knuckles white as he clung to the uneven rock, the stone a burning ember in his pocket. Finally, the lighthouse loomed, a stark cyclopean tower against the roiling sky. The air around it crackled with an unnatural energy, a raw, primal power that made his teeth ache. He forced open the heavy, salt-encrusted door. He began his ascent, each step an act of pure, agonizing will. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes rattling violently in their frames. The air was thick with a palpable tension, charged with an electric, malevolent force. This was it. The portal. Not a gaping maw, but a distortion, a shimmering veil through which he could sense, could feel, the unimaginable vastness of the entity's domain. Dean dropped to his knees, the journal falling open to the ritualistic diagrams. His fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled for the stone of balance. He placed it carefully on the floor, at the center of the shimmering distortion. He began to chant the words his grandfather had transcribed, ancient, guttural sounds that felt alien on his tongue, tearing at his throat. As the first syllables left his lips, the lighthouse shrieked. A blast of unseen force threw him against the wall, his head cracking against the cold stone. Pain exploded behind his eyes, but he pushed himself up, blood trickling from his temple. The entity was fighting back, its silent roar now a physical assault. The glass panes of the lantern room groaned, spiderweb cracks appearing across their surface. The light flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. He continued the chant, his voice raw, struggling against the entity's overwhelming power. The shimmering distortion pulsed violently, threatening to engulf him. He could feel its tendrils, not physical, but mental, lashing out, attempting to tear his consciousness apart. "You failed me, Dean. You let it take me." "No!" he screamed, his voice hoarse, pushing through the hallucination. He focused on the stone, on the symbols, on the words. The journal had warned of the sacrifice, not of blood or of life, but of self. He would become a living part of the seal, feeling its constant pressure, its malevolent presence, for as long as he lived. The revelation was a crushing weight, heavier than any physical blow. His grandfather hadn't just sealed it. He had become its jailer, its eternal sentinel. And now, Dean had to follow. He pressed his hand onto the stone, onto the shimmering portal, and poured his will, his very being, into the ritual. A searing agony tore through him, as if his soul was being flayed, stretched thin. The lighthouse groaned, the glass finally shattering with a deafening crash, shards raining down. The wind howled through the broken panes, but Dean held fast, his eyes locked on the stone, on the pulsating light. The roar in his head began to recede, slowly, agonizingly. The shimmering distortion flickered, contracted, and began to dim. He was bound. Forever. He collapsed, his body racked with exhaustion, his mind a fractured landscape. The lighthouse light, though damaged, pulsed with a steady, defiant rhythm once more, a lonely beacon in the enduring fog. He was alive, but irrevocably changed. He had made his sacrifice. The stone felt cold beneath his trembling fingers. a stark anchor in a world that had dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and shadow. The deep song, no longer a distant murmur, was a deafening roar within him, a tide of pure, ancient hunger. He understood now with a clarity that felt like a shard of ice in his mind, the true nature of the pact. Not a simple sealing, but a binding, a permanent tether. A searing cold, unlike anything he had ever known, began to spread from his chest. It wasn't the bite of the ocean wind, but an internal frost reaching for the core of him. He felt it not as pain, but as an unbearable emptiness blossoming where his identity once resided. Memories, once sharp and vivid, began to fray at the edges, like old photographs left too long in the sun. Faces, names, moments of joy and sorrow. They didn't vanish, but they became distant, as if viewed through a thick pane of glass. He was watching his own life recede, a silent, horrifying withdrawal. He gasped, a sound lost in the roaring in his ears. This was the sacrifice. Not blood, not life, but the very fabric of his consciousness. He felt a profound sense of dilution, as if his individual self was dissolving into something vast and indifferent. The deep song seemed to recognize this offering, its sonic tendrils receding, not in defeat, but in satiation. When the last tendril of sound finally receded, leaving only the dull ache of the ocean against the rocks, Dean was left trembling, gasping for breath, profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The world, though solid again, felt subtly wrong. His senses were sharpened, yet muted. The smell of salt and old stone was more potent, but the vibrant hue of the distant horizon seemed duller, flatter. He felt connected to the island, to the stone, to the deep. He stumbled away from the altar, his legs weak, his mind a wasteland of fractured thoughts. He saw the grandfather's journal, open on the small table where he had left it. His eyes, now seeing with a new, unsettling clarity, caught a faint, almost invisible inscription at the very bottom of the last page, hidden beneath a fold he had never noticed. It wasn't his grandfather's elegant script, but a scratchier, more desperate hand. He who binds the deep becomes the deep's keeper, forever the anchor, forever its ear. The words hammered into the raw, exposed nerves of his mind. He wasn't just sealing it. He was the seal. His grandfather hadn't escaped. He had simply passed on the mantle. He was the barrier, his very essence the lock. He was not free. He never would be. The air was thick with the lingering scent of damp earth and brine. The research station, the fog, ever present, swirled around him, an indifferent shroud. When he finally saw the low, squat buildings of the research station emerge from the mist, they looked like skeletal remains, picked clean by time and the elements. Rust had bloomed across the corrugated metal walls, and shattered windows stared out like vacant eyes. The main building's door hung ajar, groaning faintly in the wind. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Desks lay overturned, equipment rusted and broken. It was a monument to human folly, a place where intellect had tried to grasp the incomprehensible and failed utterly. He found a small, reinforced room, likely a data archive, its door still mostly intact. Inside, among scattered papers and overturned shelves, a heavy leather-bound logbook lay open on a console. It was filled with meticulous, despairing entries. Dates stretched back decades, detailing seismic anomalies, strange sonic patterns, and increasingly bizarre reports from the island's single short-lived scientific team. His eyes scanned the final entry, dated almost 50 years ago. The patterns are too complex, the resonance too profound. It's not a geological phenomenon. It's alive. And it's calling. The local tales, the lighthouse keeper's warnings, they weren't superstition. They were truth. We've disturbed something ancient, something that demands sacrifice. The keeper understood. He kept it at bay. But he is gone. And now, it stirs. The last sentence was scrawled, barely legible. The song requires an ear, an anchor, and it has found one. Dean's breath hitched. His grandfather had been the anchor. And now, so was he. The realization was complete, a final crushing weight. He felt no triumph, no relief. The entity was neutralized, yes, but its power now flowed through him, a terrifying current. He was the conduit, the silent guardian. The island had claimed him, not through death, but through a far more insidious permanent possession. He could leave, perhaps, but the deep song would always hum beneath his own thoughts, a constant low thrum, reminding him of his terrible new purpose. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer.